Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Deltarune video. It's finally here, the nidosphere part 2. And without further ado, actually I have some further ado to do. So, before we begin, I want to talk about a couple comments that I found very, very interesting. There are plenty of great comments on the nidosphere part 1 video. I couldn't obviously highlight them all, but these were some specific ones that I wanted to talk about because I didn't feel like I could just put them in the pinned comment without quoting them verbatim, so I'll talk about them in this video. Starting off, Mad Hymek 323 is talking about the Toriel variable that changes the unused December sprite into the black monster sprite that mirrors your movements in the Chapter 3 S-Rank room game. And is saying that the variable is meant to symbolize censorship because Toriel is hiding things from the children with the parental lock doors in Chapter 3. So it's like a symbol of that same situation. So in other words, there is a piece of information that Toriel may be hiding that is stopping us from understanding Des, which doesn't seem that, crazy. If the kids spent a lot of time at the Dreamer house, because it sure seems like they wouldn't have spent too much time at the Holiday house, then Toriel would probably be quite privy to a lot of their information in terms of like what they were doing and what they were really like, in a way that even like Carol or Rudy might not have been aware of with Des. So that is interesting. Okay, PSI Green 3864. Spamptonton has a dialogue where he says, "There's nothing to fear except," and then trails off, with, of course, the full phrase being, "There's nothing to fear except fear itself," which it could just imply the Titans, because the Titans are fear themselves, basically manifest as a Darkner. But for the purposes of this video, might be something fun to keep in mind. Pyro 335, the sword that you get in the first Sword Room S-Rank game board is inside the mail room, or what would be the mail room, Antenna's version of the game, which kind of ties in with Spampton giving you the Thorn Ring. It's giving you the object that's going to do the weird route, which again ties Spampton into everything. Spampton seems really important for some reason. I wonder if we'll talk about that in this video. And finally, a noob in disguise 4337. Nice. You get a title when you complete the Dragon Blazer's Mantle game, and it changes Chris's title to Blazer or Ice Blazer, and then Sheath if you take control of Sword Chris and try to stab Susie. So that does kind of confirm that the game is at least based on Dragon Blazers. Like maybe the Dark World has altered it into this game called Mantle, but it is supposed to be Dragon Blazers as a Dark World thing. So that is very helpful. Thank you. All right, if you haven't watched part 1 of the nidosphere, I would suggest you do that because you'll probably be very confused watching this video. It's bad for metrics when you do something like that, but you just got to do it. There's too much crazy stuff we're going to bring up in this one. And if you want to be convinced that Des is the knight, I would suggest watching this video from Mr. Brick & Co. I talked about this in the first video, how originally this was going to have to be 3 parts, and part 2 was just going to be convincing you that Des is in fact the knight. So this video is going to operate under the assumption Des is the knight, because I think this video and my own, sort of analysis has convinced me that that much is true. So if you're a Des denier, I mean, you could still watch the video anyway, but if you want to try to be convinced, you can watch this video here. There'll be a link in the description. Okay, we can start the actual theory now, and it has to start with Des analysis. I saved the Chris analysis until like halfway through the last video, but these two characters and the sort of relationship they have with each other is very important to understanding the knight, in my opinion. So yeah, let's talk about Des. Des's room is really the best look we get at her character, right? Because obviously we can't meet her. She's missing. So by analyzing the things in her room and what's sort of associated with her, I think we can learn a lot. Oh, right. Also, in Chapter 4, Gerson becomes a Darkner, right? And Ralsei says that darkness patterned after the memory of a loved one can only appear in very specific darknesses, which is why Susie can't bring him back, because she didn't know him very well. Which implies that the knight did know him very well. Alvin Knight still? No. I think that can actually feature into Des being the knight over somebody like Carol, for example, who that would have just been another adult. I don't know. Maybe it'll be revealed they had a very deep relationship. Given, I guess, the three places that have shelter codes are the church, the Holiday family, and the police station. So it's not, insane that they could have a connection there. But the teacher role takes first and foremost sort of play in the chapter, and Gerson was her teacher. She went through his class, right? Asriel did as well. So, unless she was homeschooled and Asriel and her actually weren't in the same class, because that's never been confirmed. We just know Asriel was in Gerson's class, but I mean, come on. Anyway, back to the Des analysis. We see a lot of, I don't want to say disorganization, but, things are just kind of like thrown around in her room for the most part. There's a bunch of stuff stuck in a box. There's a bunch of stuff under her bed. Her pillow is sort of haphazardly thrown to the side. The closet's full of junk. And there's a bunch of dented, expensive items in the corner. And to me, what that reads like is her parents didn't really understand her interests and kept buying her stuff because they have lots of money without, asking her. Because, the things that are here, we know her for her red guitar, right? But there's a violin, a flute, drumsticks, there's a trumpet, I think, in the closet. All of these things are more like traditional instruments, right? Obviously, a guitar is a traditional instrument. But Des was into, heavy rock music, it seems like, and, maybe metal. And they were giving her instruments that were very classical, let's say. You could even potentially interpret it as instruments that kind of fit the family theme. Violins, flutes, and drums all are very associated, I would say, with Christmas music as well. Whereas, heavy electric guitar maybe a little bit less so. So there's that. They also bought her ice skates and hockey pucks when they found out that she liked wiffle ball, it seems like, which is another thing where it's like, oh, you like sports, let's get you into an ice-related sport because we're the Holiday family. So I don't know. There's potential for something there. And what that sort of reads like to me is that, Carol and Rudy, even if they were trying to be supportive, they just didn't really understand Des at all. Or they did, and they were purposefully trying to change her, right? Which is interesting because, my second point on the slide here, she seems to have changed her name away from the Holiday sort of pun that it once had. We know she called Noelle Ellie as a nickname, which no one else seems to do. Even Rudy, who you'd think would pick up on something like that, still just calls her Noelle. Which, interestingly, you could make a nickname out of this in a lot of ways, but Ellie specifically removes all of the association with Christmas. And in the Spampton sweepstakes page, where you actually type in December, it says this address's name has been changed, right? Which means it leads me to believe that maybe it isn't so much of a nickname as she just didn't want to be called December anymore. And Noelle kind of talks about how she used to tell stories essentially of taking her to a big city far away, which kind of sounds like she wanted to run away with Noelle to the big city, which obviously didn't happen, but it doesn't paint a good image of her life in the Holiday household. What's even weirder, though, is the red heart pillows in her closet, which I do have a picture of in the next slide. The knight really seems to act a lot like Chris. You can see in all of these images, you can see also I took the middle image from Reddit and then I just added the final image there of the knight with the broken sword, or the dagger. It looks like a dagger, but it's a broken sword, I'm pretty sure. Which is an unused sprite for when Susie, sword clashes with the knight at the end of the battle. And yeah, all of these look fairly similar. The only one that I would say is a little off, because it's off to the side in the purple there, is the cooking game. I don't know what else to call it. And the knight throwing their swords to create the dark fountain in chapter 4. Because it is the same motion, but that's just because they're both throwing something downward. I don't know. I can see it, but I don't quite believe it, you know? So, other than just actions, we also know that Chris and the knight are connected because the knight sort of knights them at the end of the fight in chapter 3. The December character in the chapter 3 secret boss game, or secret S-rank room game, whatever, mantle, follows, like, mirrors Chris's movements exactly. Ties a lot into them being connected as well. And then, of course, what I was just talking about, all the red. Obviously, we know Chris to have the red soul. However, there's a lot of associations between Des and red. I mean, if we consider Des as the knight uses red energy all the time. There's a red flannel in her closet, all the red heart pillows, the red gifts, her red guitar, even though it looks orange, it's red in the game, which means the shoes in this image are also probably red. There's a lot of red with Des, which is very interesting, that she would be so associated with red if the red soul is Chris's, right? And the two seem to be paralleling each other for some reason. And then, of course, the final image on the slide in the top right is the image of the roaring that Ralsei gives us, with the Titan and the two knight-looking Titans. We know that Chris and the knight are probably working together, so the idea that in this sort of end of the prophecy situation, Chris might basically be a parallel to the knight, like another second hand to the Titan, isn't too crazy. Right, so we just talked about how December has a lot of association with red. Well, so do we, the player, with the red soul, right? And from what we know about Chris, it would seem that Des and Chris have a lot in common, despite in all these sort of memories being at odds most times. It seems like Des, too, is sort of like the black sheep, I guess black deer, of the family. And that before disappearing, she was kind of going through the same thing Chris was going through. A lack of freedom, perhaps, you could say. And maybe that culminated in taking similar steps that Chris is right now, which is, you know, working with a dark entity to try to change their fate. Of the characters in Deltarune we know so far, I think December is probably the one that best fits the lines that seem to interrupt Gaster in the opening, which is, of course, saying, you don't get to choose who you are in this world, your name is Chris. The idea that December is related to these lines does make a lot of sense, considering it seems like she is somehow trapped in the code as well, which we will talk about very briefly here in a moment. And it might explain why Chris seems to have some sort of trauma relating to Gaster, which we will also speak about in just a moment. But okay, I want to go on a slight tangent here before we continue and talk about how maybe the Red Soul is December's somehow. There's been a lot of like theories floating around that what if, I shouldn't say it like that. It's not like there's a lot. There's just a small community of theorists talking about what if December was also human and we just didn't know. Which, you know, seems pretty unlikely at this point, considering in her room we find shoes that say they're fit for hooves. Unless, of course, her parents just bought her deer shoes because she's a holiday and then she had to wear hoof shoes somehow. She was probably a monster. However, I do think there is a way for her to get the Red Soul. Noelle sort of implies in chapter 4, I guess. It feels like chapter 3, but it's chapter 4. Before we enter the Dark World, that the mumbling Chris that exists without their soul, this is in the weird route, I should probably clarify, is the Chris that she remembers, the real Chris. Which sort of implies that the Chris she knew when she was a kid also didn't have a soul? which we've long speculated that the red soul is not Chris's soul and they used to have another soul. What if they just didn't? And what if the reason for that is December? We know December for like a few concrete actions when it comes to Chris, and a lot of them include hitting them over the head with a bat. Now, I'm not saying she intentionally tried to knock their soul out, let's say, but what if one time she did? What would be the first thing she'd do? Oh my god, I knocked their soul out, I have to put it back in. If she touched it and absorbed it, then what would happen? We've never actually seen what happens when a monster absorbs a human soul and they still have a soul. Because we've seen Flowey absorb human souls, right? But Flowey, not really a monster. Flowey's more like a darkener than a monster. And he also didn't have a soul of his own at the time, right? So as far as we know, maybe they would like fuse together or something. And this was a theory that I saw floating around in chapter 2's sort of theory era, and I was like, that's so far-fetched, I don't think I believe it. But now I'm kind of on the side of it a little bit, because the red soul does emit a lot of white light all the time. So the idea that it's a human soul with a monster soul like sort of fused together, in the same way that, like, you know, Asriel became super powerful in Undertale because he had a human soul and it like changed his form and everything. It's not absurd. It's just very unlikely. But, okay, let's say this scenario did happen, right? Let's say that December did end up accidentally absorbing Chris's soul. What would happen after that? Well, if she can't remove her soul from the equation to take the red soul back out, they just kind of have to leave it that way. You know? Because a monster can't survive without a soul. They'll turn into dust. And we know that from Undertale, and it might not be the same in Deltarune, but we know that monsters still turn to dust in Deltarune, so I'm inclined to say it's probably similar, if not exactly the same. So a monster soul can't persist for very long outside the body, and the body would like turn into dust. So December can't take the soul out. And Chris seems to be kind of fine without their soul. We thought, like, in the Chapter 2 theory era, that Chris would die if they were away from the soul for too long. That was one of the big knocks against Chris Knight, right? Was that how would they make it all the way across town shuffling around without the soul? But in Chapter 4, they do a lot without the soul. A lot of acrobatic stuff, technical stuff with like the piano playing, physical exertion, hitting us with a hockey puck, you know, or a hockey stick. They also hit us with a hockey puck, but that's less physically taxing. It kind of seems like they just have the soul because they need it for their plan. Maybe something to do with, obviously, the Dark Worlds, as the person on the phone with them sort of implies. So if this sort of scenario did take place where Des accidentally absorbed Chris's soul like early on in their lives, they just kind of have to live with it. Like, Chris can live on without it, December can't live without it, and that's kind of the place we're at, right? And it would explain a couple of things in a very interesting way, I think. One of them is why December has so many red heart pillows in her closet and why Carol seems so obsessed with the red heart pillows. Because I think, you know, maybe she found this out, and the idea that she might know about the prophecy and have realized, oh my god, you know, a cage with human soul, maybe like December is one of the heroes from the prophecy, my daughter. That's not crazy. She seems pretty, you know, obsessive in that way. And it gives context to this line, which seems very odd to us in chapter 4, where Carol puts her hand on Chris's shoulder and says, sorry about all that, Chris. As you know, you are welcome here anytime, but the you is highlighted in red. And as we just said, or we just saw, rather, earlier in the scene when Noelle was talking about things to us it was also highlighted in red. So this implies that Carol knows about the red soul and knows about the player even. But what if instead of specifically that, Carol knows about the situation with the soul? The fact that it is technically December's, but, you know, actually Chris's. So when she says, as you know, you are welcome here anytime, she's actually talking to December. Because she's obviously, like, Chris doesn't have a key to the Holiday Mansion still. So it doesn't seem like Chris is really welcome here anytime. And we've never been there before, so it doesn't really seem like we're welcome there anytime. But, you know, December being welcome there anytime, that does make sense. So, I don't know. It's far-fetched, it's crazy, but I wanted to bring it up because I could. All right, back to the night. What's her plan? This is something I'm very, I don't think is talked about enough, let's just say. People talk a lot about, like, okay, why did she try to take Toriel, but then she took Undyne? And, like, how does she carry Undyne to the bunker if Des is the night and she's, like, a pile of dust or something? How is she able to do that? There's more questions, though, that I don't think people are really thinking about. Why almost cause the roaring in Chapter 4? Surely her goal isn't just to cause the roaring. Clearly she has some sort of plan with Chris, right? Even Ralsei didn't seem to think they could defeat the Titan until Susie and Chris figured out a way to do it. So was she just gonna destroy the whole world? Kind of messes with their plan, doesn't it? And if she can do it and that's her goal, why doesn't she just do it all the time? Why doesn't she just start the roaring in the shelter? You know? So that's a pretty big question for any knight candidate that wants to start the roaring, really. But especially for it being December. Why is she only acting now if she's been missing for years? Did the shelter fountain just open recently? That's really the only explanation I can think of. And then she got, like, brought back to life or something. But then that conflicts with the idea that she has a light world form that could carry Undyne to the bunker. You know? She can't just want mindless destruction like the Titans, aka the roaring, if she's planning something with Chris. I already talked about this, but the idea that she has a plan at all means she isn't like a mindless monster, right? Like, she clearly has some level of foresight that the Titans, for example, don't have. They just kind of lunge around and try to eat you. Or blow you up with lasers, I guess. And of course, there's then the issue of the voice in the code. If Des is the knight, what about the voice in the code? Who's the voice in the code then? Well, the voice in the code is no doubt December, I would say. If you haven't seen the 2 new entries yet, I'm going to read all of these for you. It'll take a while, but it's important. The thing that I think confirms this is December is in the Chapter 4 text. So, in Chapter 1, there is a hidden code in the files of the game called Unused in all caps, so it's related to, like, Gaster and the depths and all of that. And it goes, Where am I? Hello? Anyone? Is anybody out there? Someone! Anyone! Can anyone hear me? It's dark. So dark here. Someone, anyone, if you can hear me, say something, please. Which is also kind of weird, because these seem to be updating with each chapter, which means that if this is December, she woke up when we showed up in Chapter 1, which is kind of weird. Kind of implies that that might be when the shelter fountain was made. Okay, the Chapter 2 dialogue. No one can hear me, can they? I guess not. To be honest, I'm not even sure I can hear myself. It's so quiet here, and yet sometimes I swear I hear something. Something like scratching? Now, in the Chapter 2 theory cycle, we thought this was the fact that Snowy and Monster Kid were kind of toying around at the shelter door, and she was hearing from inside the shelter them, like, scratching at the door trying to get it open. But upon Chapter 4, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Chapter 3 is very interesting. What is this place anyway? How did I get here? As if I haven't asked that question 1 billion times already. I always did have that nightmare. Walking into the darkness with the light shining from the doorway. Then the door slams behind me and everything goes black. Is this that nightmare? Or was everything else a dream? unsettling thought, the idea that, like, yeah, this is everything that's ever existed is just empty blackness, and you accidentally had a dream that was your entire life. Anyway, obviously this parallels exactly what happens to Chris and Susie in the closet in chapter 1. They're walking in the darkness, the light shining from the doorway, the door slams, and then everything goes black because they entered the dark world. It seems like December couldn't enter the dark world, though, and instead she's somehow ended up in the depths. Chapter 4. I'm starting to lose track of the time. Has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it had been years, I might believe them. So that's hint 1 that this is December. Before, the sun came up, and so many wonderful things happened that made time meaningful. Things like breakfast or late night TV. That's hint 2, because the last thing we just did was talk about nostalgic memories of December coming over and watching TV, right? And then in chapter 4, we start by having a big breakfast. So if the idea is, maybe December would sleep over, December and Noel or something would sleep over there sometimes, and then they'd have breakfast in the morning. It's clearly sort of paralleling what just happened to us in chapter 4. In this place, I don't eat or drink anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. I can't tell if I'm dead or alive. It's nothing but pitch black silence, except for that noise. The scratching noise I sometimes hear. This sounds crazy, but even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like somebody's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. So that's very sad. It also confirms, to me anyway, that the noise is actually us digging around in the code trying to find her. So, that makes sense. But her description of, I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming, I can't tell if I'm dead or alive, there's nothing but pitch black silence. Other than the pitch black silence part, that sure does sound like a dark world, right? I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. That is a very belabored point when it comes to the dark world, that they're like dreams. And then I can't tell if I'm dead or alive. I mean, we thought we killed Birdley in chapter 2 in the weird route, but he's actually in a coma, so he's not dead. So perhaps a similar thing happened to Des, where, she died in the dark world, and now she's sort of in this suspended state, just like Birdley is, maybe? Anyway, what this tells us is that, is the night December? Because it sure seems like December is lost in the code, right? But I do have a thought on that. The night is December, but the night is not December. And yes, that sounds crazy. But December's mind seems to be inside the code still, in the depths or whatever. However, we don't know for sure that the same thing applies to her body. Whether that body be, dust or something else, right? Just a comatose person, like I was just talking about with Birdley. So what if something was able to puppet, let's say, her body, and essentially take it into dark worlds? She's got no soul, if the soul actually is the red soul. And even if it's not, I would still argue she probably doesn't have her soul intact, or like her going into a dark world would create something much worse than what, would happen if she was just fine and not quote unquote snowgraved or something like that. And it kind of explains what we see in chapter 3's, not chapter 2's, chapter 3's secret route there, where the black deer becomes this black monster before like we even enter the room. So the idea that, the black deer is gone, it is literally unused. This is an unused sprite in the game. And it's replaced by this monster instead. Which, as you see, I've put Friend's face on it, and that's for a good reason. Because I think Friend might be related to a certain yokai called a Pakeneko. Now, I'm not going to claim to be a genius of Japanese cultural studies or something. But I came across this when looking up sort of like cat monsters. We already talked about in my Mad Cats video that came out during the lead up to chapter 3 and 4's release, the idea that friend really seems to be related to cats, right? We got like rare cats, we got all the cat petters mini games it shows up in. Even the Tale of Hell Take Crawl seems to reference those cat petters mini games, and of course there are dancing cats in the cat petters mini games too. And there's even more reasons, which we'll get to in a second. And a lot of people have related friend to a lucky cat. And the reason for that is because finding friend seems to be a matter of luck a lot of the time. I think it could also be related to this specific sort of Japanese folklore character, which is essentially a cat yokai with various abilities. And these abilities include dancing, speaking human words, manipulating dead people, cursing humans, and, most importantly, possessing humans. Now, obviously, the real world doesn't have monsters, so when they say humans, we're just going to think of that as lighteners, all right? And there's also this little quote. This is from a Wikipedia article, so again, not like set in stone information, but it says that in the Edo period, there was a folk belief that cats with long tails like snakes could bewitch people. Cats with long tails were disliked, and there was a custom of cutting their tails. It's speculated this is the reason there are so many cats in Japan with short tails now, natural selection having favored those with short tails. And we know, of course, the Tale of Hell Takes Crawl. And if the tail is taking crawl, that sort of implies it's not attached to the cat anymore, almost like it's been cut off, right? And it's trying to return to its, master. And, I mean, I have to bring it up because people have been talking about it recently. Temi made a tweet, and this is what it says. It might be related. So, okay. The idea is that friend is essentially using December's body, which is inside the shelter dark world, and puppeting it around in order to become the knight, essentially. And that explains a few things. It explains why the knight seems to be acting a lot like Chris, because in part 1 we talked about the fact that friend is probably the red horn headband that got lost in the shelter when whatever happened in there that gave Chris trauma. And this makes that even more sound, because the knight's appearance seems to be related to Noelle's fears. Other than the cat petter stuff, which, I mean, that would be Friend's other form, which is the cat petter stuff, like the glitchy games stuff that we think about. All the sort of, I don't want to say Lightner specific fears, because the Titans are not that, but that might be unrelated anyway. More of her major fears, let's say, sort of manifest in the way that the knight acts and looks. So, we already talked about Chris. Carol, it seems to have Carol's antlers and use a black sword that could be a reference to her black katana, which we learn about in Chapter 4. It would make a lot of sense if Carol is something Noelle instinctually kind of fears, given her reaction to her coming home in Chapter 4, and the fact that in one of the blog posts she talks about having to sort of hold in her screams so that she could continue doing this thing that she's interested in, because she's afraid that her mom will come in and take the game away from her. So this idea that she's always kind of looking over her shoulder because of Carol, it does, track with everything we know about them as a family so far. And yeah, that would explain why the knight has Carol's antlers and this black sword. The Titans. This one's a little bit more shaky because it's possible, like I was talking about with Friend last video, in part 1, that the sort of Titan-like aspects of these creatures could be because they are related to fear as well. So, the connotations around being a fear creature is the Titans, right? So all these Titan-like features you see in the grid here, the sort of dark fountain trail that the knight has, the one where it literally looks exactly like the knight from Ralsei's depiction of the roaring, and the sort of shape of its body might be because it's some sort of fear creature. Or, Noelle goes to church, she's in the choir, so the idea that she might have, as a child or even now, be afraid of the roaring isn't too crazy. I mean, that happens in real life too, and, people learn about the rapture, and there are some people who are so obsessed with it that it just drives people crazy. So yeah. But the last two columns are a little bit harder to explain. What do you mean Noel's afraid of Des? No, stupid. Des is the one that protected Noel. From who again? Oh, right, Chris. And who was the knight fighting in that battle? Oh, right, Chris. So the reason why the bat only appears in this one battle is because it is the connotations of, oh, the Red Horn headband relates to all these memories of Chris being a little troublemaker prankster scaring Noel. So it reflects in the way that the knight fights Chris by getting this bat to show up. And the red energy, it could be related to the fact that December is like the true quote-unquote recipient of the red soul. So this red energy that the knight emits is because of that. Or it could be because Chris is the true holder of the red soul, and then it was lost to December, right? And the red horn headband is then causing the knight to have red powers because it's related to Chris. And then finally, the Gaster part. It's a little harder to sort of justify. To be fair, these two Gaster specific things I've picked out are only really based on Gaster from like fandom interpretation. The idea that he's a skeleton, so this like skeletal rib cage the knight has, and the idea that he has holes in his hands, which we've never got confirmed in anything, obviously. However, there is that idea I proposed earlier where December is the one that interrupts the Goner Maker sequence. And in that case, you know, December, Gaster, and Chris are all players in that specific scene. So the idea that might also relate with the Red Horn headband, which sort of represents Chris, it all kind of ties in together, even though it's a little crazy. So the biggest thing I want to point out is this thing at the very last point in the slide, which says, because the knight is being influenced by the Red Horn headband, it's almost become like a Chris version of Flowey, which is pretty interesting. We already know Darkners are basically made through a similar process as Flowey. They're basically things without a soul given determination, and then they come to life. So the idea that the final boss of this game is also kind of Flowey does track. And it's almost like a specific parallel to how Flowey comes from Azrael, because Chris isn't specifically Kara, right? But they're kind of filling the role of Kara. So the idea that like, okay, this is what if Kara was Flowey is kind of funny. And the reason I have the bird in the bottom right of the slide, because this is the only knight form that I can't sort of chart out anywhere. It's the only thing the knight does that I'm like, I don't know why they do that. Why can they turn into a bird? But I do have one theory. It's just very bad, and we're going to get there in about 3 seconds. So, I did say I was going to talk about Spampton, and there is a reason for that. This is even more evidence that Friend is some sort of puppet master that controls people. Maybe not always literally, but in this case, kind of literally. So, Spampton has a line where he says, "Friends? Chris, what are you talking about? You don't need friends. I can make my hands into phones." So other than the visual sort of similarities between Spampton and Friend, which is the giant forever locked in grin and the yellow and pink over the eyes, there's also sort of a connection here in this line with Friend and phones, which does kind of make sense, because if Friend is taking the place of the knight in this story, then Friend is the one who drove Jevil and Spampton insane, or, you know, gave them the shadow crystals and then they drove themselves insane. At least in Jevil's case. I guess, I don't know, it's sort of implied in chapter 4 that the knight did something to Jevil that drove Jevil crazy. And yes, Spampton, it's probably kind of the same. But the specific connection between friends and phones makes me think that, you know, Friend might have been the one on the other line of Spampton's sort of mysterious benefactor situation. Which does make sense, because You heard of elemental pairs? With a valuable item, you can defend against Puppet Cat, or Thunder Light, or Dark Star. Just watch out for the bleep that use Death Scythe. Never again. Puppet and Cat is the elemental pair that Spampton has. Spampton is obviously a puppet, the other half of that being a cat. The idea that Friend is a cat that is controlling Spampton. Oh, okay, that makes that make a little bit more sense, right? And there's a lot more that ties them together. The first place we see Friend is in the Chapter 2 basement where we fight Spampton. And they're both referenced, it seems like, in Noelle's blog. Spampton gives out peepus, which are kind of eggs. And Friend and the Eggman, as we established in the last video, are linked. So Friend also kind of gives out eggs. Noelle says, I sort of feel like there were more, though. Like, one time I remember getting a cat and it actually lowered how many points I had, which does happen in Rare Cats or the actual Cat Petters games we can play in Deltarune. And that cat is Friend. And then, of course, I died immediately, so I couldn't get a picture or anything. And, of course, no one else seemed to see this. So, it's a little spooky. The gamepad that Chris uses to access the mantle game in Chapter 3 is one with ugly pink and yellow buttons. Now, obviously, this could be related to Spampton, but I think when we think about pink and yellow, we think of Spampton, when really we should be thinking about Friend, because Friend is the originator of that, and Spampton, notorious copier of people, is probably the one that copied that, rather than it being the other way around, where Friend is influenced by Spampton, right? So this controller, for some reason, is appearing in the Dark World in this ugly pink and yellow fashion, and nobody wants to use it. And that seems to be related to Friend too. Friend seems to be about controlling people. It's all coming together. The second blog post on the right here. A white egg showed up on my screen, but there was a message with it. Special. White egg, again, connected to the Eggman. It's in Cat Petters, so it's connected to cats. Cats connected to Friend. Spampton is also connected to this because of the peepus, and talks about it in the Twitter FAQ from the sweepstakes. They're so interconnected, man. And in Chapter 3, it's possible to encounter peepus in the hidden room in TV World. This is the one that Tenna has stashed away. But if you don't have the Dealmaker puppet scarf from beating Spampton, then the scene doesn't play where he gets sprayed with foam. So instead, Tenna just leaves it on the floor and you can put it in your inventory. And after around 10 minutes, it'll change from a certain person's special, which, yeah, that links to the white egg that's called Special from Noelle's blog, cannot be used in battle, to a certain person's special, it's now tweeting. And it starts to emit a distorted tweeting sound, which maybe, just maybe, that is why the knight can turn into a bird, because somehow it is through like 5 degrees of separation linked to the peepus hatching into a bird. There's going to be some sort of bird. Maybe it's Starwalker bird. Who knows? Kind of going crazy here, as you can tell. But okay, if Friend is the one that contacted Spampton over the phone before eventually abandoning him, what if he is now doing the same to Chris? Spampton was never destined for a shadow crystal, nor Chris a soul. It's a little poetic way of saying the shadow crystal was inside the Neo body. Spampton wasn't actually given it directly. He had to kind of like steal it. And Chris was never actually destined for the red soul. It was going to go to the vessel, but maybe through December's meddling or something else that happened, Chris ended up with the soul. I mean, Spampton and Chris are already directly paralleled so often. It's kind of, I don't have to prove that, I don't think. I just think the connections, or sort of the mirroring between Spampton and Chris, is actually deeper than we thought. They're actually both being manipulated by the same person, trying to break their strings, doing the same thing that, Friend did to Spampton. It's very interesting. Spampton is convinced by taking the red soul, he'll be able to become free, able to see past the dark and into heaven. Maybe Chris felt the same way, and that's why they've ended up with the red soul. And now everything they're doing working with the knight, who would be Friend, talking over the phone to them, which we see in Chapter 4, would be part of a similar plan like Spampton and Friend originally had before Spampton got abandoned. Which is why Spampton keeps saying stuff like, you'll end up just like me, Chris, destitute without all your friends in a garbage can. Because Chris is going the same way, betraying their friends to try to do this thing. But okay, what is the thing then? That's the most important part. Why is Chris working with Friend as the knight, possessing their old neighbor's, like, I don't want to say corpse, but comatose body at the very least, in order to, like, cause the end of the world? Like, why, Chris? Why would you do this? And there is an idea I have. What if the shelter is a shelter? Because, you see, calling it a shelter specifically is interesting to me. Like, obviously, you have the concept of a storm shelter or a disaster shelter. But we've been calling it the bunker for so many, months upon years, that you'd think if there wasn't some sort of meaning to calling it a shelter, Toby might have just said, okay, let's just call it the bunker. So there must be some sort of reason to call it a shelter. Maybe it's just that, bunker has some kind of military association, even though December has rations in her room, and where else would those have come from but the shelter? So clearly there's some sort of, connection there. But anyway, whereas a shelter has more like, okay, this is where you go to find protection. But even so, even in saying that, the shelter is a place where you go to find protection from whatever is happening in the real world, which is kind of what the Dark Worlds already are. So my guess, let's say, because this isn't really like, part of the theory. The theory is that Friend is puppeteering December's body to be the knight. This is more so just, okay, but maybe this is why. Maybe the Shelter Dark World is some sort of perfect world Chris is trying to create. Because we've got so many repeated sort of, I don't want to say foreshadowing necessarily, because we don't technically know it's foreshadowing yet until, whatever it's foreshadowing happens. But we've got this repeated sentiment over and over that the Dark Worlds are an escape from reality and that they're just better than the real world. They're like dreams where everything is good and can be fixed. And specifically in chapter 4, that Susie keeps saying she wants every day to be the same as the last. And she says, you want that too, don't you, dumbass, to Chris. And so if Chris wants to create a world that's free from the real world aspects of change and loss, the Dark World would be a great place to do it. And the shelter, a place where nobody ever goes, would be a great place to start doing that. And what if it's a little bit more crazy than that? What if the idea is, because the prophecy says the three heroes will meet at World's End. What if it's not the light world? Like, I know, we think it's the light world, right? That makes sense. But what if it's this world inside the shelter? Because I don't think Chris would make, like, a fantasy land necessarily. I think maybe what they would try to create is a world that's like when they were kids and everything was perfect, right? Sort of like what we see in the chapter 3 egg room, for example. So the idea is, if you take everyone from town that's important to you, let's say, or you think deserves to have a better life, and you put them in the bunker and you make sure they can't leave, then the bunker world is their new reality. This is their new life, right? Where there's no strife and everything can be healed, and it would save Rudy, and maybe it could save Des, and all the Darkeners and the Lighteners would be equal, and maybe the family could come back together again, right? Azrael would never have to leave for college again. All of this stuff that we've got set up throughout Deltarune. And I think it might also explain something about why Chris, or the knight rather, wants to take Toriel while she's sleeping and decides to take Undyne instead because she's making such a ruckus. And we kind of get this implied in chapter 2 where Noelle and Birdley think it's all a dream, right? Susie sort of says, oh, it's a dream, you're dreaming. But okay, if Toriel was asleep in the chapter 3 world and got taken to the shelter, when she woke up, she would think she was still in a dream. And she would just think she was in a dream forever. and she would never want to leave, right? She never get the thought to leave. It's sort of what Toriel does to us in the beginning of Undertale, right? She's like, oh, this is your home now. Isn't it so perfect and wonderful? And if we, as, Frisk, didn't know there was, more out there, maybe we would have stayed there forever. It's a very dreamer-like thing to try to force you to stay in a perfect world forever. So maybe the sacrifice Undyne is apparently scheduled for is stopping her from being able to leave the Dark World, because she was taken while she was awake. So she already knows something's wrong. Like, it could even be that Azrael's already in here, and that's the reason why Chris is the only one who can talk to him. And maybe, like, in this world, the night turns back into December, Like, all of this stuff, it could be true. So Undyne has got some sort of sacrifice that's going to stop her from leaving, which might involve taking her soul out of her body. Yes, that would turn her into dust. But again, if this is the new world, right, and we don't have to worry about the light world, it doesn't matter if that happens in the light world. The light world doesn't matter anymore. Because yes, Chris sort of displays this feeling that the light world doesn't matter. When we first possess Chris in chapter 1, they've got no possessions, they've got no hobbies, they sleep through school, and they just like go home and eat and go back to bed. They've got like no interest in anything in the light world until Susie and Ralsei show up, right? And it would make total sense if the reason for that is because they've got this awesome other world that they have to be like, present in the light world every once in a while, in order to keep their schedule so nobody goes looking for them. Until, of course, they can get all of their family in there and the police who would look for them. And, then, woohoo, we're set. So yes, the reason Chris doesn't want us to enter the bunker is a combination of things. They do have trauma related to the bunker, but it's also because they're afraid that we as the player are going to seal their perfect world that they're creating within the shelter. In other words, they're using the place of their greatest fear to create a world where they can control everything. Which, if you, go back one video to part 1 and talk about Chris and how they used fear to try to regain control of their life, it all perfectly kind of segues together. And that's because I made it up, but also it's hinted at in the game. So yes, in summary, why try to take Toriel but settle for Undyne? What is the sacrifice? Everyone has to stay in the bunker once they've entered a dark world. Chris doesn't want Toriel to have to, undergo the sacrifice, though. So it would be better if Toriel could just be whisked away to the shelter world with, while she's sleeping. So when she wakes up, she thinks it's all still a dream and, there's no strife there, right? How does the night carry Undyne to the bunker? Well, Des might not be in control of her own body, but her body still exists. And, okay, let's say it's not dust for the sake of this. Friend is a darkener, but we are also kind of like sort of an ephemeral being inside of the soul, So if Friend is some sort of powerful Titan monster, maybe Friend can still pilot December's body in the light world. And the body still exists, even though it's separated from her mind, seemingly. So it's possible. Why almost cause the roaring in chapter 4? And if the night can do it so easily, why not do it any other time? The roaring is not the end goal of the night's plan. However, what happens to the light world doesn't actually matter, right? If the shelter is the new world that we are creating, that everybody has to eventually go into, having the roaring happen, it's collateral damage, right? If the whole world ends outside the shelter and turns into like a shadowy prison or whatever, well, maybe the shelter world will be fine for some reason. I don't know why. Ralsei seems to imply that all the dark worlds would, all the darkeners would turn to stone. But the shelter is related to gastery stuff. We don't know. There might be something more to it that would stop that from happening. But there's also the possibility that Friend or Chris just already knows how to stop the Titans, right? Because Friend is already kind of related to these like fear entities. So maybe Friend is confident that Chris can kill it, you know? Like, oh, the Red Soul can just kill it. This is just, you know, buying time for my escape. And it doesn't really matter what happens to the Church Dark world. None of these Darkners really matter to us. So just blow it up. Who cares? Why is the Knight only doing this now if Des has been missing for years? It could be because of Azrael's return, like I have in this slide. The idea that, okay, Azrael's coming home, so we need to sort of amp up our plan. But it could also be because they've been doing this secretly for quite a while. But now they're starting to, now we're here and we're causing problems. And also the prophecy is actually started up. Like, maybe they need the prophecy to be happening in order to eventually do this, right? And then, okay, Des wouldn't want mindless destruction, and it seems like the Knight is planning with Chris. Well, December isn't the one piloting the Knight at all, and Friend is clearly a feared entity like the Titans, but with more presence of mind, so it kind of just tracks. And that's the theory. The theory is essentially that Friend is able to control people, including, like, physically, literally, and is using December's body, which might be in a comatose snow gravy type state, inside the shelter in order to become the Knight, gain determination to create dark fountains, and sort of act out this plan to eventually replace the light world with this much better dark world. And this is all sort of Chris's idea, and Friend is doing this for some reason. I don't think I can really just figure out Friend's motives quite yet. It might be that Friend is just, you know, indebted to Chris, because Friend is the Red Horn Headband. Chris is the reason they exist at all. So maybe they just like Chris, so they're doing this for Chris. They do say, or at least the Forgotten Man, who is related, obviously, to Friend, says that he is trying to help someone, but he can't remember who. So maybe Friend is also just there to help Chris, like actually being a friend. I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns, obviously, with Friend, but if there's one thing you can take away from this video, it's one, Friend controls people, and two, the Knight seems to be based on things that Noelle might be afraid of. So okay, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. As always, I will try to read your comments in a timely fashion. These videos have accidentally gotten too popular for me to read all of them at this point, so I apologize if I don't get to your comment. But you guys always have very good ideas and such, so I'm excited about that. As for plans for the future, I want to do some smaller videos now. These ones take a lot of, like, effort and, you know, research. So I do have a couple low stakes Deltarune conspiracies that I can put out soon-ish. And eventually I do want to get to Shadows on the Wall Part 2, which I've mentioned before in these videos, but it's like my one theory from the Chapter 2 theory times that still kind of holds up. So I want to do an update for that. I have a lot more stuff to add to it now that we kind of know a bit more, maybe, about the way Deltarune's going. So yeah, if you have anything you really want me to talk about, you can also leave that in the comments. If you think there's a theory you really want me to discuss, or there's something you've picked up on that seems like foreshadowing that you want me to dig into, I'd be interested to know that as well. So yeah, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, perhaps, and I will see you next time. Bye.